you remember yesterday, we looked at Indiana Jones, and we were talking about the city of Petra. And so this is a culture that was conquered by the Romans, but it was not a Roman culture. It existed during the Greek and the Roman time. And so it was finally conquered by Trajan in 106. We were focusing a lot of our attention on Trajan yesterday. Today, if you want to go see it, it's in modern day Jordan. Okay. So the whole city is off a slot canyon. So a slot canyon, if you've ever been out to national parks in Utah, like Zion National Park is a good example of a slot canyon. It has a very small valley and then ravines on either side. And so the Sick is the main entryway into the city of Petra, which basically is just a slip canyon that was made into a road. And so it's got this beautiful kind of rosy colored stone. And you can see a lot of the temple kind of peeking through. So we have two images from the city of Petra. We have the Treasury and the temple, or the Great Temple, I should say. So this is 181. The reason it's in 181 and not, we might not have our, do we have our note taker on this? Did I include it? Is it? Yay. Is because it's in Asia. So it's in the Asian section of the unit. So this is the city of Petra. You can see that there are numerous structures that are all cut in the walls of the cliffs. So this is a rock cut city, and it's also called the rose-colored city because of the color of the stone, and of course how that lighting hits the stone in that setting. So it's all kind of based inside this valley in a series of hills, like cut into the hillside. So there are many different examples of their tombs in Petra. Most of the tombs were small, kind of modest looking structures that were cut into the walls, just like Egyptians cut into the tombs. They were numbered, but they were not labeled. So it's very mysterious. We don't have written records to tell us who was buried where. And then some of the structures that we know today that are a little bit more grandiose, like this one, which is called the monastery, is also a tomb. Just early people thought because of its size that it must have been like a living quarter. So of course, then they just made the assumption that it was large living quarters for like monks or something like that, or religious people of the city because of religious imagery on the face of the tomb. And so they kind of made those assumptions. So the confusing thing about Petra is everything is named something, but that's not its function. Okay, so we'll talk about that as we go. The god images in Petra are these betel stones. And so there's a series of altars and they're cut into the rock face. You can see that they're not that big and they often have these stylized faces that we believe are god images. So it's like little altars to the gods. And you can see it's kind of in the valley, it's in that slot canyon. There are elements and influence from Greek culture. So they have a typical Greek theater cut into the cliffside. And I know it's Greek and not Roman is because it is a half a circle, right? Romans would have done a full circle. Greek is like a half a circle. And then this is a temple, the quasi-elvent is a temple. And then we have our great temple. Now, this is the image that's included in the image set. It's a horrible picture. Okay, it's a horrible picture. It doesn't give us very much information whatsoever, but it is what it is. So I'm going to show you some better images to hopefully help you understand what it actually is, because it is not a temple. Okay, it is not a temple. Okay. So It is an audience hall. How do I know it's an audience hall? Okay, let's look at the plan. Okay, we've looked at plans of other structures. We've looked at the plans of the Parthenon. We've looked at the plans of the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. Okay, how do I get into this audience hall? Can you guys find the entry? What's the telltale signs that we have an entryway? Oh, I thought you were raising your hand. It's a set of stairs. So the set of stairs is right here. This is a Propylaea. Remember the Propylaea in the Parthenon? It's a grand entryway. So there was a grand entryway. You can see it off of the road. It's right here, right? And so there was a set of stairs in the Propylaea for you to walk up. And then what do you hit? What is this thing? It's a big open space. What do you think it is? It's a courtyard, right? So it has an axial design. It's a courtyard. Now, I think that this is probably one of the reasons why people thought this was a temple, because a lot of temples had courtyards for big communal gatherings. But this one has another set of stairs, and it takes us to the boulderon. That's a Greek term we had. Do you guys remember what that was for in Greek culture? The boulderon at the agora. A little review of our vocabulary. What's that for? What happens in the agora besides it being a market and a place of philosophy? Trevor. It was a government building. Do you see anything that makes us think that they might have held governmental proceedings in this part here? What do we see? Yeah, go ahead. It looks like a mini amphitheater. So I could stand on the floor and I could talk to my other, I'm going to call them senators, representatives, the other members of the ruling party, the ruling classes. So just like we had in the tholis, the round structure of the Greeks, we see that there is like a sort of a mini amphitheater. Looks like a mini Greek theater inside this area. And then there's a series of smaller rooms that would have maybe been for other sort of meeting and gathering spaces. Okay, and it is terraced and it's on a platform. So, you know, this is probably one of the reasons why people thought it was a temple early on. It's raised up on a platform, just like a Greek temple, just like a Roman temple, right? It's elevated, but this one is more elevated to show governmental power rather than religious power, okay? And we see that for governmental structures all the time as well. So just looking at the plan, we can see elements that we recognize. You see columns, right? You see circular columns. You see the Greek style like amphitheater. You see staircases. There's a lot of our telltale signs. And so this is, I wish the view they gave you, but this is not the one that they did, right? This is not the one that they bought the rights to. So here you can see a little bit better about how it was kind of in a bigger, more open area. It was close to the markets. It was close to, you know, the typical center of the city. But it was elevated. So you see the stairs, you see the courtyard, you see some of the remnants of the columns, and then you see how it's elevated one more time. So there's another set of stairs to get to those meeting halls. Okay, so it was built into the ravine, or what they call the wadi, which was the main center of the city. And just like any other typical Roman city, Trajan and future, like the following emperors, when they took control of this, they brought Rome to Petra. So they had shrines to water nymphs, they had markets, they had gardens, they had baths, they had pools, which is pretty impressive in such a dry place. I saw a really cool, you know, of course, when we were in COVID, We watched a lot of TV, and I think I watched on National Geographic on Disney Plus. They had a how Petra was built, and they talked about how they had a very elaborate system of gathering water. And so from miles away in the hillsides, they would make channels that use gravity, just like the aqueducts. I mean, they're basically aqueducts. They'd have channels that would connect to one another to bring the water from the mountains all the way to the city of Petra. And that supplied water for large baths. And they had hot and cold baths, and they had water fountains, and it was lush and it was a garden in this dry climate. So once again, symbols of Roman prosperity. As well as the prosperity of the Nabateans. Remember, they were incense traders, so they were quite wealthy. Okay, so this is the style of what we think the Great Temple looked like. And so once again, probably understanding why we thought it was a temple and not a governmental building is that it had a temple front. Now, if you look at it kind of carefully, you see that it has like smooth and fluted columns. And then at the very top, it had, I thought I had a close up. Oh, there it is. It had animal capitals. And so remember that animal capitals were also kind of similar in like Persepolis, right? The Persians, they used animals rather than your typical Doric, Ionic, that sort of thing. So this is kind of a more of an Asian-inspired capital at the top. And so if I look here, can you see different animals? What animal is this? What animal do you see here? An elephant, very good. And then this looks like some sort of tiger or some sort of feline. So it has a lot of similarities to typical sort of Roman-like structures, right? It's raised, it has columns, it has a pediment. Now the treasury is off of the seat, right? The sixth, and it is cut into it. It looks an awful lot like that building I call a monastery. So is the treasury really a treasury? No, it is elaborate tomb. It's a very elaborate tomb. We do not know who was buried here. All of it was raided before it was like rediscovered, right? But by looking at the plans, I think you can sort of get an understanding that was probably a tomb, because notice the really small chamber at the end, kind of cut into the deepest parts of the rock, right? So it had a very large opening as we kind of walk in, and this is what it looks like today. It was painted, right? It was painted on the interiors. There's these, everything is rock cut. So remember, they're cutting away at the stone to make all the different chambers and all the different rooms and the different walkways. So the function of it is it was some sort of important tomb. And we know that because of the size and the scale and the elaborate decoration. So how was it built? How was it built? Any ideas? Once again, the video on National Geographic channel was really fascinating. They constructed walkways and started from the top and worked down, which makes sense, right? You work at the top and start and work down, because start at the bottom, things would fall on you. So they were literally on like scaffolding that they made. They carved the scaffolding out of the rock because timber was not prevalent in this area. They had very limited timber that they had to reuse or recycle. And so a lot of it was cut out of the stone. There was walkways across the territory or the slot canyon. And then they later carved it away to get rid of the walkway. And so they started at the top, and they had to have very precise plans in order to get it to look as organized as you see here. It's a lot easier to build a structure to carve away a structure, right? So they had to be very methodical about their plan. So they carved it out. You can see that it is not in front of the rock, but it's set into the rock, right? So it's like taken out. And so it's very different. Now, we want to compare this to something we know. So if we compare this to the Pantheon or the Parthenon, all our two P's that we have to keep straight, right? Let's think about how the facade is different. Okay, I think the same is like a little bit easier to figure out. How is the facade of the Treasury different than what we saw in ancient Greece and ancient Rome? What's some differences? Yeah.
Columns and then the roof. And there's another step.
Right, so it's a two-story temple. This was not particularly uncommon, especially in the Roman times. They did this all the time. We just don't have a lot of really good examples of it in the city of Rome. But we do see examples in future churches. And so when we look at Baroque churches, they're going to look a lot like this, where they have two stories, and it's almost like two temples. It's like one is on top of the other. Anything else different about it? Yeah. Right. It has a very limited porch area, and there definitely is only one entryway. So it's kind of more like Roman-like in that you have one way to get in rather than being able to enter from any four sides or any two ends. Good. It also has what we call a broken pediment. Okay. What part do you think is the broken pediment? Yeah. The one on top. So a pediment, right, is that triangular shaped section on top of a temple. And on this one, you can see how it kind of comes apart so that we can have this little round mini soulless temple kind of stuck in the center of it. So this is something we'll review later when we see some Baroque churches. Baroque. It's no longer Monday, right? Churches, when we see them in ancient Rome. And then of course, this is cut rather than constructed. Okay, so the imagery. I don't know how many images or all the nuances that they'll ask you on the content, but it has different images that are fairly visible today. It has reliefs of the Amazons, so the story of those large women warriors. It has a central figure of Isis Teak, which is a combo god. It's the Egyptian goddess Isis and the Greek goddess Teak of fortune. And then on either side, underneath that first one, we have Greek twins Castor and Pollux. They're the protectors of travelers and the dead in their journeys. So the images of those two people on either side helped, anthropologists decide that this was probably a tomb, right? Because of the symbolic imagery of the protectors of the dead, and then fortune and Isis, right? Because Isis is connected with Egyptian death as well. Okay. Questions on Petra? Okay, so we're going to move into images of later Roman power. And so this is Marcus Aurelius. This is a really good example of a bronze sculpture of a ruler. One of the reasons why this one is still in existence today is that people thought it was St. Peter. And so it's not St. Peter, it is Marcus Aurelius. And I know because he's got curly hair and a beard, and I've seen countless images of him. But how was power conveyed? How did this high emperor ruler, he's like right after like Trajan and whatnot, How is power conveyed? Yeah, hold on.
He's on a horse that shows that he's pretty wealthy and he's like, yeah.
He's looking down on a crowd of subjects. What's that hand doing? What is that international symbol for the Romans now? When I have my hand outstretched, what am I doing? You know? Reading, talking, right? We see that on Augustus from Porta. We saw it on the Etruscan example of the orator, right? It's kind of this gesture of talking to a crowd. He's on a horse. How would you characterize the horse? This is not an image set, by the way. How would you characterize the horse? What's the horse doing? What's the horse doing? Ben, what do you think? What's the horse look like he's doing? He's panicked, he's rearing up. But look how cool, calm, collected Marcus Aurelius is. It's like, this horse is crazy, right? It's rearing up, it's spooked or something, but I got it under control, right? And notice his scale. Doesn't he seem a little big for that horse, right? So power is conveyed through his calm expression, his gesture, his size, and his commanding presence over that horse that's spooked, right? This is in Campidoglio, which is on top of Capitoline Hill. This is where the Jupiter Maximus Temple was. Now it's the City Hall of the City of Rome on one side, and then this is an ancient museum that has a lot of beautiful, like Flavian busts, so those women with the curly hair. And this sculpture of Marcus Aurelius, the original, is inside. They recreated it and placed it on a pedestal in the center, and all of this courtyard and the style of the buildings were designed by Michelangelo, right? So during the Renaissance. This sculpture would have been very similar to like the sculpture that Trajan had in his forum, okay? And this is one of the reasons why I'm showing it, to kind of give you an idea of how these rulers portrayed themselves to the people in the forum, right? Now this is Commodus, who was the son of Marcus Aurelius. Anyone see Gladiator? I know it's kind of an old movie. This is the crazy one, right? How does he convey power? What does he have on his head? Does anyone know? Yeah. He's wearing a lion skin. He has portrayed himself as Hercules, right? So he's got the Nemean lion and he's holding the golden apple. And so he's showing himself as in the eyes of a Greek god, right? And so you see that there's a lot of highly detailed chisel and drill in the hair, very like conscientious of detail, right? And that's a very Roman thing. However, also idealized, he's got, muscle definition, that sort of. I should say here too, notice how Marcus Aurelius is wearing typical like Roman attire, right? With a toga. And he's also got what we often call like the philosopher beard that makes him look like he's distinguished. It makes him look old. It makes him look wise. And it's a typical symbol of power in this kind of like later part rather than like clean shaven ruler. Okay. But it portrays him as a ruler. Okay. 3rd century was very chaotic. After the high empire of Hadrian and Trajan, we start to see a lot of infighting and the decline of the Roman Empire. And so here's a series of like Septus, and then, oh, I can't remember the guy on the left, but can you tell in their facial expressions that things are not well, right? Things are not well. You see furrowed brows, you see anguish, they kind of look a little pissed off, right? They look a little angry. And so we can see that turmoil even in the realism that we have here. This is the time of, this is Diocletian and trying to remember the brother's name. Do I have it at the bottom here? Septus Severus, Geta, and Caracalla. Now Caracalla became the emperor because him and his mother killed his brother. And that's why we have the destruction of his image in this painting of the royal family, right? And so it tells you a little bit about what was going on during this time. Let me get rid of that panel for us. Okay, and then they have this great idea. The territories of Rome are vast, right? They're not as vast as they once were, but it's really hard to organize this vast empire. So they have a great idea to divide it into four, and to divide it into four regions. And they're going to put different capitals. So Rome is still like a capital, but there's different Romes in the territory. So there's one in like Germany, and then there's one in, I can't actually remember all the others. But there's like four, and they're going to have a Caesar and an Augustus in these regions. And so the Caesar is kind of like a subordinate to the Augustus, or the emperor, and then it's like they're going to rule together. How effective do you think it is to have four people in charge? It's not at all, right? This is a sculpture that's actually in San Marco in Venice. So it's a little out of place, but it shows you images of the tetrarch, these four rulers kind of embracing each other. One of the reasons why I keep it in is because it shows us a little bit about Roman style, right? We have that on our Kala. Notice how the figures are no longer proportional. This is something that we start to see in later Roman style. Big heads, small bodies. So no longer kind of like Greek sort of proportions. It doesn't mean they go away completely, but we see this new style emerging. So Diocletian, he thought it was a good idea. Okay, so then we have Constantine. And you probably already know a little bit about Constantine. He's best known for what? What's Constantine best known for? There's a few things. Does anyone have any things that they heard about him? Yeah. Christianity. He was the first Roman emperor to no longer make it illegal. He did convert supposedly on his deathbed to Christianity. His mother was a Christian. But really, he just said any religion that's in our territory is now okay to follow. You didn't have to, align with the Roman gods. And so it allowed for other things like Judaism and so on. Let's go ahead and watch this video on Constantine. It'll give us a little bit of background about this time, and then that will lead us to kind of looking at our last few images of Rome. And in early Christian art is Roman art too. So we're going to continue with the Romans.
Well, there's the head.
And elbow.
I see a knee and a finger pointing up.
And a shin.
And a foot.
Another foot.
We're looking at the remains of a colossal marble representation of the Emperor Constantine.
And this colossal sculpture was originally, we think, about 40 feet high. So really big.
And it would have filled this extraordinary space at the end of the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine.
This was a very large public space right here on the Forum. And at the end of it was a rounded area, a niche, and the sculpture was found there. So we think it was meant for that space.
Michelangelo is the one who actually brought it up to the Capitoline Hill, which was the ancient government center. Constantine is certainly a Roman emperor, but he's the last pagan Roman emperor and the person who really ushers in Christianity and all of the changes that will take place in Italy and in the former empire.
Well, and he moves the capital of the empire to Constantinople, the city of Constantine, all the way in the east. And so in a way begins the decline of the city of Rome that we see happen in the Middle Ages.
So maybe it's not so inappropriate that we see him in fragments in this city.
I find this portrait so interesting. We think his body had a core of wood and mud brick and maybe was covered in gilded bronze. We're not really sure. but I find him so different looking than other images of emperors.
Well, this is a really interesting stylistic moment. When we think about ancient Greece and ancient Rome, I think most people just think of the high classical moment and all of its naturalism. But we're talking about a long period of time in the classical era, and styles change there also.
If you think about the history of Roman emperors and their images, you often see a combination of realism and idealism, so that the citizens of the Roman Empire could identify that particular emperor. So we know what Hadrian looked like, or Trajan looked like, or Vespasian looked like.
Right, there has to be enough specificity so you can say, that's my emperor.
Exactly. But at the same time, they were idealized to greater or lesser extents, and thereby recalled ancient Greek sculpture. And by idealizing them, they were made to seem divine or godlike. But here, Constantine doesn't look like either of those traditions to me.
Well, this was a moment of real transition. It's not the issue between a kind of really high-pitched naturalism that can actually capture the characteristics of an individual's face and a kind of idealism. This is actually a kind of abstraction of the human body.
There's something abstracted, I think, about the oval shapes of his eyes, where we have a sense of them being reduced to geometric shapes, the way that his eyebrows form these semicircles around the ovals of his eyes. There's something that looks geometric about not only his face, but his hair. And maybe this is a sign of moving toward that symbolic way of representing that we see with the beginnings of Christianity.
I think it's impossible to untangle it from the rise of Christianity because of our subsequent knowledge of what will happen. And I think we perhaps don't know enough about the subtle shifts in Roman style. But my understanding is that there was also different kinds of representation for different strata of society, and that one could recall the sort of imperial past, one could recall the more intellectual pursuits of the Greeks through kind of naturalism, but one might speak to the here and the now and the broader population through a greater degree of abstraction.
Through figures that look to us as disproportionate, maybe stocky and stiff in their movements, without the lovely contrapposta that we see in ancient Greek and Roman art. So he seems to be looking beyond us and not really in the here and now. And maybe in that way, too, there's some suggestion of the Christian and the heavenly.
Well, certainly of his divinity.
Okay, so they went into it a little bit about how he moved the capital to Constantinople. And so the city of Rome itself was basically like no longer fashionable, right? It was being conquered by invaders, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. And so it was on the decline, but that doesn't mean art wasn't being made for the city. And Constantine needed to exert his power there because he's no longer there. So he had a colossal sculpture of himself made for his basilica. This Cairo symbol that is a symbol associated with Christianity and Christ supposedly appeared to him in a vision when he was at a very important battle. And so they say that that's the symbol that allowed him or made him believe that Christianity should no longer be outlawed because he was being supported by this other God, right? And so all of those areas of power, right, is conveyed through his scale and his size, and it would have been placed in this basilica made out of concrete. So this is the Constantine and Nextess. That was his brother, his co-ruler. After the Tetrarch, they went to two rulers, and then Constantine conquered Nextess, and he became the ultimate ruler. This was one that was developed first by his brother, and then he then called it his own. And the format of this one is even bigger than the Basilica of Ulpia that we saw at the at the Forum of Trajan, right? What's the biggest difference in the format? What's the biggest difference that we see? What's the biggest difference? Go ahead and chit chat with the people sitting next to you. What's the biggest difference in the format? Okay, who can give me one difference? There's a few. What's one difference? What did this table come up with? One difference? Anyone want to help them? One difference? We have to go back to having to talk to each other again. We can come up with one. Yeah, it could be a tiny difference. There's not as many columns. Okay, so instead of having side aisles are these little aisles that are kind of, the roof is held up by columns. They used barrel vaults and groin vaults to create the interior spaces. Okay, so we see that. So no longer, it's like side niches rather than side aisles. Okay, anything else different? Notice the ends of the Basilica of Ophia have two of these apses to it. This one actually has only one, and then Constantine added another one, but it's not on the end. Okay, and so here there's a sense of balance to it. Here, what he could do, if I go back to this image, is he can put that colossal sculpture of himself, right, sitting in that apse so that he's commanding power when he's in Constantinople. He still has a watch over the city of Rome and all of the people who are still there, right? So it's very grandiose. We think he was probably not entirely made out of stone. That could be by choice. That could also be because all the resources of the empire have moved from the city of Rome, and now they've moved it to Constantinople, and they need that to build the new walls of Constantinople, all the new monuments and palaces and buildings and structures and all that stuff that they would need to glorify the empire of Rome. Now, Constantine also had an arch built to him, and this one is located near the Colosseum, and it's quite complex. Oh, I must have got rid of the slide. This is very similar to the Arch of Titus, but it's a lot larger. So the slide that I can't seem to find here, let's see if it's gone. Maybe I just skipped it. Yes, I did. Unskip it. I tried to make a little bit of a scale sort of thing. It's very small in comparison. It's very grandiose. And so what he did is he borrowed and pillaged, or people who designed it borrowed and pillaged from the Forum. And so they took images off of other temples, off of other monuments that were dedicated to other gods, or other gods and rulers, like Marcus Aurelius. They looked at Trajan. They looked at Hadrian. They just stole stuff, right? Yeah. They borrowed and stole. So it could be an illusion, like we often do in the Forum. Let's take stuff from great rulers, because of course Hadrian and Trajan are the pinnacle of the empire. It's the largest. They're the most powerful, right? And the Marcus Aurelius was right after. Or it could be, I don't have enough artisans or money to make my own art. I'm just going to steal from someone else to glorify me. So you see Roman style in the close-ups. Even the ones that weren't done in the time of Hadrian, we can see these rondurels are from Hadrian rather than Constantine. We see that inclusion of the style. Notice how the figures are no longer proportional, right? They've got big heads and little bodies. These are slightly earlier. This is from the time of Constantine, where that proportion is even more exaggerated. So they are very stocky bodies. Big heads, little bodies. And that's a lot of people think, oh, this is the downturn of Roman society, Roman style, Roman art is on the downside, but it also was a conscientious style choice. We have new religions gaining power, and those religions had different style considerations. One of them, especially when we talk more about early Christianity, is intentionally trying to make work look like it comes from a different world, right? How do I make something look ethereal? Our world is not ethereal, so I have to make it intentionally look different so it looks like it's of another world. And so we think that's sort of the connection with a slightly different style. So very uncharacteristic or un-Greek-like proportions. Okay, so the last part that we have is Roman images of death and the afterlife. And so we're going to skip this. I want to make sure we have some time to review tomorrow if we don't finish everything. But on Khan Academy, they have a article on death ritual. And so they had very elaborate cemeteries outside the walls of the city of Rome. So just like the Greeks, they like to bury their dead or cremate their dead on the outskirts of town. Okay, they often built things like catacombs, which would be kind of like necropolises. They'd be cities to the dead on the outskirts. They had very elaborate tools if you were wealthy enough. Okay, and we have different kinds of funerary practices based on if you were a free person versus a citizen. And we also have some different characteristics in the style of people of power. So burials, they often would have sarcophagi carved. And a lot of these sarcophagi were carved by craftspeople who could make them look either Christian or pagan, because they used a lot of the same sort of symbolic images. And so a lot of these images on the sarcophagi tell us things about the different kinds of funerary processions that they had. They also had dramatic displays of mourning, pulling of the hair, crying. People would lacerate themselves and bleed. Very Greek-like in a way, right? Very Greek-like. But we also have extended family and enslaved people mourning, and so we have images of the elite. Okay. The style of them is that big head, little body characteristic, and we're going to see that in the Ludovisi sarcophagus when we look at it tomorrow. Okay, so keep in mind, and this is just kind of continuing that theme of death, that they have practices we've already known, right? We have portrait busts of our ancestors. These were often wax or stone, right? And they were portrayed, they were housed in your office, in your home. In Egypt, they continued the practice of wrapping mummies, but instead of having, they would use Roman style painting for the face on flat wood. Okay, so these are Roman paintings on those mummified bodies. And I know they're Roman because they have big eyes, right? And they look very like smooth and modeled. This is very characteristic of Roman painting. And then we have this monument to death we talked about yesterday. What part is connected to the death of Trajan? What part is connected? Yeah. Right. So this would be where his ashes would have been kept. Okay. We'll do the Ludovisi battle sarcophagus tomorrow, which is our last ancient Roman piece. And then from here, we'll move into early Christian and be moving into the Middle Ages. We'll still continue looking at Roman art though, because Byzantine art and early Christian art is also still Roman. It's just later Roman.